to the Radults podcast. This episode sees us joined by local larrikin Jimmy Kyle, best known for being a member of the band Chasing Ghosts, as well as emceeing at Australian tattoo events nationwide.
Welcome to the Radults podcast. I'm your host Brenton, and here we also have Mike. Say hi to the people, Mike.
Hi to the people, Mike.
And today we have a guest, and that guest's name is Jimmy Kyle. Who are you, and what do you do?
It's a good question. What do I do? So I'm a musician, which is probably primarily what I'm known for. I perform under the name of Chasing Ghosts nowadays with 5 other chaps, which is pretty rad. And then I'm the host of the Australian Tattoo Expos and the Rites of Passage Tattoo Festivals. And additionally to that, I'm an educator and a advocate in the Aboriginal community on Indigenous issues. So I teach Aboriginal culture and history professionally. That's my day-to-day gig between music and tats, pretty much.
I really want to touch on the emceeing and the hosting that you do with the tattoo expos that you do. I did see a video of you holding a mic going to some extreme heights. I want to know, going into that, were you afraid of any heights, or was this a new thing? Did you feel put on the spot to do this, or was it your idea?
So we were in maybe Perth or somewhere, and Matt Curzon, who is an epic tattoo artist, but not just that, he's a really witty and funny guy. He's a good banter dude, loves taking the piss out of me. So we were on stage, and one of the performers had some sort of lift thing that goes about 9 meters into the air, and I have mild anxiety around heights and confined spaces like most people, and so there was just a bit of a, Jimmy, dare to get in that and spin around and hang upside down. So they put this harness on me, and I was like, of course, yes, I'm here to entertain, sure. So next minute I'm in the harness and spinning upside down, which was fine at around 1.5 meters, 2 meters, and the crutch was getting a little bit of, compression that it wasn't enjoying too much. It was riding up a little bit, and then next minute we were at 4 meters, and then we were at 7 meters. Then my eyes were closed as we got up around. It might have got to 14 meters, and I was getting higher and higher. So, and the wire was thinner than a shoelace. So I was just peeking out, and the whole time Curzon's on the microphone taking the piss out of me. So standard day in the office. It's made for some good banter and got a few giggles out of it. But that's sort of pretty typical hosting duties of entertaining folks at my own expense generally.
Yeah, look, with those sort of heights, I've resigned from hosting all tattoo expos even before I've been given those offers. So that's definitely not for me.
Now, it's interesting that you're doing this emceeing work. Curious how you made that transition from being what essentially is a musician into having a job entertaining people in another way. How did that come about? Probably
anyone who's known me for a fair while knows that I am inclined to be able to talk the leg off the chair. I'm a narrator, I'm a storyteller, I'm an orator, and I think that comes through with the music. I think that's come through with lots of my friendships. So I was at one of the first Rites of Passage tattoo festivals, and Mitch 13, who I'd been good friends with for a lot of years, we decided to catch up, and I just, might as well do a piece together while we're there. And so he was tattooing me, and the host at the time, who was a musician as well, who had been organised to do the festival, had declined on really short notice. That I think there was something that had occurred where they'd pulled out, and so they were short of a host, and Mitch politely being one of the headline artists, was talking to the owner and just threw me under the bus and was like, "Get Jim to do it. Jim will do it. Jim's great. Get him to do it." And I was like, "Yeah, man, let's roll." So they gave me the mic, and next minute I was walked straight out from being tattooed to being up on stage, trying to hold together a tattoo festival on the spot. So then they're like, "Can you come back tomorrow?" And then after that, they just kept asking me back, and then sent me a contract and said, "Would you do this, this, and this?" And I said, "Yes, terrific, let's do it." So it's been great because it's similar to the music community. It's its own community, and there's a lot of crossover, of course, and there's a lot of people that know from it. But it's been great to learn a lot more about the craft, and which is probably something I have appreciated the most. And heaps and heaps of other mates. Feels a bit like school camp. Everyone gets together and there's a bit of excitement about everyone flying in from another state, and you're all flying into a big party for 3 days, and lots of tattoos and lots of laughs and lots of hangovers. So yeah, it's pretty good.
Is there an expo that goes by that you don't get tattooed at?
Yeah, there is. I had a couple of smaller pieces. So usually of a Saturday morning is probably, once I'm finished doing media, that tends to be the quieter time. So I get like maybe 2 hours. And a couple of times, friends of mine who've been in town tattooing, it's like I've taken the opportunity to just hang. I've got 2 hours where it's a bit quiet, and I could get tattooed from, Mike in the hand and the other arm's getting tattooed. But the last year I haven't. So this this Rites of Passage in Sydney coming up in later in this month. I'm going the night before to be tattooed by Tattoo Lou, so I'll fly in at sort of 6:30, race straight over to her studio, and she's tattooing a traditional Aboriginal piece, Praying Mantis, which is my people's totem, and we're going to find somewhere to stick it. We're not sure exactly where, but she's unreal. So that's been good. There's been lots of hookups from it, but sometimes if I can squeeze it in, I do, but not all the time.
Now, we did mention, of course, and you mentioned that you are a musician under the name of Chasing Ghosts, but I understand that's not where you started your musical journey. Can you give us a bit of background on how you ended up being a solo artist and what you did prior?
So originally, when I was a grommet, I was playing in a band called Sulo, which was like my first kind of high school band until I was in my early 20s. And Sulo was had a little bit of prog rock, had a little bit of new metal, had a little bit of metal, bit of heavy rock sort of sound at the time. And I then sort of grew up in that band, and that was the first band I really toured in and kind of learned the ropes in. A few different sort of reincarnations of that band existed that was becoming more and more towards the metalcore kind of thing. And then eventually I was in a band called Bellevue, and there's a couple other bands in between that, of course. And Bellevue was like a screamo melodic metalcore band, something down that, you could reference, let's say, Atreyu, something down that path. And then that sort of was when the Australian crossover there. The Australian music scene was touring really, really heavily, and so I spent a lot of time sort of touring with bands, and that's sort of where I made a lot of the friendships that I have today. And after all the heavy music, in one form or another, had sort of wrapped up, that's when I was like 26, and I decided I might do something solo. And for a lot of years, I'd sort of, friends had said, "Why don't you do something that's more orientated around singing?" And so I released the first Chasing Ghosts record, not sort of anticipating that it would do much, and instead it just kept growing and growing and growing over years, and then eventually that sort of turned into bringing more and more people into the fold, and the sort of crossover. So Andrew from Come Back Kid Goose, he produced the last record, and Lincoln Lefevre's produced the current record we're soon to release. And so those hardcore roots are very much still there, but it's a very different sound, and that's just how it's sort of where you start and where you end up. It's a bit of a journey.
Given your abilities as a storyteller, have you felt or found that this transition into a more spoken or sung approach musically has actually fit you better?
I think yes. I think the more that you lean into your natural gifts, the better people tend to do. And I think when I was doing heavier music, the way that we engaged an audience was by crowd participation. So that's one of the big things in hardcore I always really enjoyed was watching how you engage the audience. And so when it turned into an acoustic act, essentially, that's turned into, Chasing Ghosts has gone on its own journey, but in its initial stages, one of the lessons I took out of hardcore was, how am I going to engage an audience? And you can't mule kick your way across the stage with an acoustic guitar a whole bunch. And so it was like, well, it's the engagement that the audience really enjoyed in hardcore, and when I was the worst guitarist ever for Confession, my brief demise into brutal hardcore, watching the way that a crowd would participate with a hardcore band, they want to be directed into to drop their any sort of anxieties. They want to be directed into movement very much. They want to participate. So the job is to try and remove people's what's the word I'm looking for? It's their anxiety of being self-conscious. So when it came to acoustic music or folk-telling music, then suddenly it was like, well, I have to engage folks with a story that they can follow along to, so they can just be present in the moment and drop any sort of self-consciousness about being engaged in the performance. So Chasing Ghosts, I think, for its moments that it does best is when the audience feels they're having an intimate moment with the musicians. And it's essentially the same thing. It's about removing people's self-consciousness and getting them into feeling like they're participating. So you're still directing people, but you're just doing it in a slightly different manner. That's kind of where I've tried to lean into that as much as possible.
Yeah, I've noticed that with your live shows, you tend to have your audience participation by you tend to talk in between songs, tell a bit of a story, whatever you're going on, even about your general day-to-day life, and make anecdotes that other people can relate to. How much of that do you feel is a part of the art form and a part of, I guess, who Chasing Ghosts is to make sure that you relate to these people?
A lot. Essentially a lot, and probably more so. It's probably started out as swapping out a physical engagement from hardcore into like a more verbal engagement. But as time's gone on, and now that there's 6 members of Chasing Ghosts, it was one of the things the members in the band had talked to me about, is saying, hey, look, that's a real essential part of what you do, and we notice that from the outside. Don't lose that even if we bring in more members. And so it's become a greater challenge. I think when it's acoustically and I can set the pace on stage, it's very easy for me. It comes, that's a default part of my personality. When we have 5 or 6 guys on the stage, you've got to start to consider, I've got 5 blokes standing up there waiting for me to stop telling the yarn. So then it's suddenly you have to recognise it in the set as, okay, well, there are probably times where it's more poignant to go on that journey and have this this orator experience, this narrative, and then there's other times where maybe it's time just to get in and let the song do the work. And so it's probably becoming something we're more conscious of not losing that, but how do we personify it and balance it out in the whole performance? It's definitely a consideration now, because I think what it does best is it sets up a context for the songs. So then suddenly the lyrics have even the more cryptic lyrics can have a context that maybe people would miss otherwise. Especially, remember the days where you'd buy a record and there'd be the lyrics on it. So you would read every single lyric and you'd be like, oh, that's what he says.
Absolutely.
Oh, that word. Oh, I thought it was this. So in absence of that today with Spotify, it probably helps people go, oh, I thought he was saying X, Y, and Z, now I understand exactly what the person's saying. So I don't want to rob people of a little bit of applying their own story, but I also don't want people to feel they're in such vague places that they can't understand what I'm singing about.
Yeah. Like, hold me closer, Tony Danza.
Yeah.
It's definitely that.
That's a really good example.
Touching base again on, like the experience that people get at your live shows, I have noted that if there's rude punters or people that just yell out obnoxious stuff, you're the first person to throw them under the bus, but also you take the piss out of yourself, be it that you've got to like stop to tune the guitar and say all that. Like, is that a deliberate thing? Like, do you deliberately want to call that person out, or are you making it more real for the people around you? You call people in, if they're standing at the bar, you tend to say, like, come closer and all that sort of stuff. Or is that just more, you won't let that sort of shit fly at your shows?
A little from column A, a little from column B. If someone's being really obnoxious and rude, I'm inclined to, I don't know, I'm probably grateful, because I'm like, well, the fly has fallen into my web. Now, I can sort of spray a bit of banter and give them a bit of shade, but most of it's in good fun. And no one likes to come to a show, even if, like, I've been the person who's been tanked several times at a show in the one night, and then and you don't realise that you're being louder, and you're trying to talk over the music, and you're still enjoying the music, but maybe you're at the back catching up with a friend you haven't seen forever. So there is a little bit of grace of, you've got to let people have a bit of freedom at a show. However, if it's a pin drop moment, and it's super quiet, and clearly the audience is engaged, and Fiona's on a phone talking to, Cindy about what happened last night on the Kardashians. Thank you, Perth. I've had that experience. I've had so many. I had one dude I remember in Perth. I don't know what. It's just, I'm not digging on Perth. It's just twice. A guy in Perth. He was like being really obnoxious and carrying on and singing out and just like being a distraction, not just having a bit of banter with his mates. So I absolutely lined it up, and I started giving him a bit of shade, and it was pretty funny. People had a joke about it. The dude went and bought 4 shirts afterwards, bought the albums. He was stoked. He was part of the performance. There's a lot of people who take it with good humour, and they realise, oh, sorry, I'm being a bit louder, I'll pull up. But I don't want anyone to feel too alienated, and I don't want to lecture people too much, but I probably am inclined to be like, hey, you're being rude not just to me, but to the rest of the audience who are actually here to participate in this. So there's a bit of a balance. Like I said, it's column A, column B. If you come to my show and do that, then you've been warned. Comedians do the same thing, and half the time I've coached people to be aware of this. So it's really good when someone's not aware of it, because then I'm like, this would have been a boring set, but now you've turned up. This is going to be a little bit more amusing. I don't know. I've had people front row on the phone having a conversation, just like, really? Is this what we're doing? And so I'll just stop the performance, and they'll go a good like 30, 40 seconds without realising, and the whole audience just looking at them. No, it's kind of funny. You just got to laugh at it. That's just how I deal with it. But
it probably provides a bit of light and shade in your sets too, because like, something I do want to touch on with you is that most of the Chasing Ghosts material is quite in depth from an emotional or contextual point of view. So it probably does help in terms of balancing out the vibe in the room, because you get into some pretty heavy topics at times. With you having to choose now your spots to talk, has it become difficult for you to choose the topic or the song or the moment that you want to push the most in each performance?
It's definitely a more conscious decision. You also want that ability that if there's a really nice moment, or there's a really funny moment, or someone's being, a goose or whatever, and then you've got a good one-liner, you do want some sense of spontaneity. You don't want it to be like, oh, I seen the same show in Adelaide last night, and it's exactly the same. But yeah, there is a bigger consideration that there are 5 other performers on stage who equally in their own right have brilliant careers, and that you have to pick the most poignant parts. We're probably looking at a performance now as a bit more of a journey, and trying to take people on a journey, and that's a big consideration. There was something really learnt on the last record, and on this record that we're about to release, we're really trying to think about how we take it to another place. And the topics as well are really different than previously, in the sense of it's something that's been pointed out to me a couple of times, is a lot of the songs that sound quite happy have incredibly dark lyrics. And a really early example of that would have been Hare and the Hound on the first record. Hare and the Hound's kind of like, it's in a major key. It starts out kind of like feeling quite like a graceful old country song, and then it just gets dark real quick. And there's some stuff like that now. So yeah, I think you said it better, is that light and shade. So how do you balance it out? But we're definitely more conscious of it now, and I think that's just growth as a performer, is looking for where you can grow the performance.
So you spoke about having other band members, join Chasing Ghosts and everything like that. So, and not only that, but these people are staples in, former bands, current bands, all that sort of thing. When did you decide that you wanted a band with this? How did you go about choosing the people to join that? And what's the progression from there, from a solo artist to having a band? What sort of things do you have to think about when, I guess, writing music?
Probably thought about it between the first 2 records. The first record has an ensemble at points, which was done with session players, and then we had the second record, again session players, but more typical band orientation. There was some piano and cello and things like that, like on other performances. Coming to this record, we wanted to then replicate that at a bigger sound. So the first record, I was like, forget the ensemble, let's strip it back to an acoustic guitar. By the time we got to the second record, let's offer something different. Let's not tell the same joke twice and hope the punchline still sticks. Let's try and give people something different. I think people wanted maybe the second record to be very similar to the first record, but I've always been under the sort of inkling, don't give people what they want, give them what maybe they need, because had I released the same sounding record twice, I think people wouldn't have been interested. I'd rather people didn't like the second record, but at least had an opinion on it, than being like, oh, it sounds just like the first one. So then the challenge was, well, okay, me and Goose went overboard. We put grand pianos, we put cellos, we put Hammond organ, lots and lots of stuff. There's a vibraphone on it, and in the first record there were things like banjos and stuff like that. So this time around it was like, okay, well, how do we replicate that? So hence so many band members to try and replicate the sound. Coming towards a third record, now we didn't have session players. Now we had guys that knew the material, had a really good sense of the sound, and could add their own flavours and their own parts that they've kind of enjoyed about the music and accentuate those a little bit more. So it's probably, I think this record is a bit more of a condensed sense of what Chasing Ghosts is. It strips right back down to kind of 6 dudes banging it out, and there's a lot of puns and jokes in that last sentence. It sounded like a mass orgy. 6 dudes banging it out. But it's, it's more of a band feel, even though there's a Hammond organ and there's piano in it. It's just been an adjustment, and it comes with new challenges. So we're just bit by bit trying to be really honest about what those challenges are, and as a team have a bit more of a collaborative response to how do we fix those. So that the big one was, we don't want to lose the storytelling. We don't want to, we want to have 6 dudes on this, but we don't want to lose the storytelling, and we're just finding the adjustments best we can.
We've touched base a couple of times on the fact that there's a new Chasing Ghosts record coming out.
Did I mention there's a new Chasing Ghosts?
You did.
Yeah.
So let's talk more about the Chasing Ghosts record that's coming out.
Yeah.
First, when might people expect to hear something from this record? And second, when might they get access to the whole record?
Yeah, right. This summer, so is the plan. So this summer, yeah. Coming to a cinema close to you. Now that there's there's a bigger team of management involved, and so that's all sort of their call. But there's a record sitting there waiting to go. So, and I've begun working on another record because I'd like to try and get my personal best, my PBs down a little. It was 5 years between the first two records, so now I'm just aiming for to make it shorter and shorter and shorter. So this time it's just over 2 years, closer to 3 probably by the time it comes out. But then we'll be dropping some new material, and we're just enjoying writing great tunes. And I'm not the sort of person who wants to release every 18 months just stuff that I'm not particularly happy with. I'd rather release tunes I'm happy with. But hopefully the record's sitting there, and we're looking at it not too long, which is pretty exciting because we had a conversation 6-8 months ago, and I'd finished half of it, so it's all done now, which is great. But probably takes I try and take a fair bit of time to get the storytelling right, and that's probably the harder part for me, or the most time is spent in that space. So yeah, this summer, folks, get around it, get amongst it.
So I mean, you mentioned about having even future material already recorded, and having that all ready to go. Do you feel that I guess so that it doesn't stay stagnant? We're in the day and age of Spotify where everyone's releasing singles all the time. Do you feel like maybe that's something that you could potentially do, I guess, with the stuff that you have got, so that, like you said, you don't want to sit on everything and then just write and record for the sake of writing? Is that something that you'd potentially look at doing?
Yeah, a lot, and that's been a massive mental adjustment. Is going. I had a little thing I wrote on my wall: adapt or die, and because you got to think, when I first started playing music, CDs were a big thing.
8-track.
And then I had to physically get my head around releasing records that the physical record wasn't necessary. It was merchandise. It wasn't CDs anymore. So that was, and then there was sort of a resurgence of vinyl, but that was sort of more as merchandise. People were going to listen to stuff on their phones and not necessarily in their car CD player anymore. So during that period, there was like a mental adjustment, and now there's this adjustment again, which is, well, it's all going to predominantly be online. That doesn't work in every country. So when you tour Asia, you have to sort of go back to, they want physicals, and that because a lot of people aren't going to have smartphones, that are ultra expensive in developing nations. In some parts, Japan's going to be very different to, let's say, Indonesia.
Yep.
So that sort of notion of, okay, now people are going to listen to music differently. So if you bought the first record and you had it on a CD, most people want to hear is, it's the CD that just stayed in my car forever, so I listened to it on repeat. Then the second record, people would be like, well, it's the first song on my iTunes list, so it comes on every time I go onto the car. A parking lot, because it started with the letter A, would be one of the first songs that would pop up for people. So, okay, so now with this record, it is considerate of the fact that Spotify, people probably aren't going to necessarily sit down and want to listen to a whole record. They're going to only want to listen to 2 or 3 of your songs amongst 10 other artists that they might listen to 2 or 3 of their songs. And so, we've been mindful of that, and I think it's probably like a duck to water for young people, because that's the generation they're growing up with. But we've seen music change in multiple shapes, and how it's delivered in shorter increments of time as time's gone on. So the adjusting has been happening at a more rapid rate. So we've gone from 8 years ago, let's say, still releasing physical records, with from that time going to predominantly being online to now it's virtually all online. We don't have a whole lot of record stores. We have vinyl stores, but we don't have, CDs and shops a whole lot anymore. Even JB Hi-Fi is like, it used to be a thing. You'd go and you'd get a picture of yourself with your record down at JB Hi-Fi, and it was a nice little chuffed moment because everyone wanted to see their record in a store. That would be a moot point now for a lot of bands. They wouldn't necessarily be racing down. And if a band released a CD today, I wouldn't go and buy it. I would go buy their vinyl at a show. I'd go listen to it and maybe buy the record online. But it's just a different way of doing things. So we've had to adjust, big time. And this record was written with that in mind for the first time ever. So there's no point in me doing 13 tracks like on the last record to have the first several be really heavily listened to and just the diehard fans go through the rest. The rest of the record seems to be for the diehard fans, but for the casual listener, it's really the first several tracks. So I think the shift is now releasing more consistently, closer together. Not as much content, but just drip feeding content a little bit more. And people were saying that years ago, and I was probably too set in my ways to really trying to quite understand that. I'm the sort of dude that use an abacus before I'd use a calculator. Do you know what I mean? Like, and most people are like, calculator? Do you mean the one on your phone? I'm like, no, I'm an abacus, dude. I'm old fashioned, so I've had to adjust. It's good though. It's fun. It's been cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a weird thing. Like, I mean, even down to the point where I remember, probably 10 or so years ago, I'd buy a CD for the sake of going home, putting it in my computer and putting it onto iTunes so I could have it on my iPod.
Right, yeah.
And then, like, that CD, again, would live in a car.
Yeah.
Or it wouldn't live at all. It'd go on a shelf because it's like, well, it's on my iPod now, so I don't need it. And then, you've got Spotify come out, and it's...
changed the game.
It does, because now I do find that because I feel nostalgic, I'll buy a record. I love the vinyl, stuff like that, especially as soon as they say that it's limited edition. You put that word in it, those two words together, and say vinyl, I'll be a sucker and I'll pay $70 for something that has probably been mass produced, but I'll have it because it's limited edition and buy it at a show. But at the same time, I'm not going to listen to that too much on vinyl. I'm going to be like, but my phone has Spotify. So, I don't know, it's a weird thing.
You're talking about a practicality of, like, it's so easy to put your headphones in and, pop off and listen to, pop off down to the shops or go to the gym or whatever, and you're going to listen to your tunes through your phone. You're not going to bring your portable record player to play your vinyl with you, obviously. So, I've got a vinyl player at home, and I tend to have a collection of records that I've bought at shows, and I tend to probably now spend my money at the show, and grab a shirt, grab a record for the band, and hopefully they get a better return than elsewhere. But I'd probably then go onto Spotify and listen to it when I'm out and about like everyone else. So yeah, I agree with the sentiment. It's just a shift. I think it's getting the concept, which most people have by now, but it's merchandise. It's not, it's not about physical CDs anymore. That's probably a conversation 3 years ago that most people have shifted onto, but now this is the first time we're really designing. For example, we're looking at the track listing. Oh, how do we want to list, each track? I'm like, guys, and no one cares. Yeah. I'm like, Spotify will do that. Give them what you think are the strongest tracks from first to last. But we're not taking people on the journey that we once would have on a record, where you want songs in different keys put next to each other, rather than maybe songs that are in the same key, or songs that that create an arc in the listening experience. That's probably not as important now as going, well, what are the stronger hooks? Let's move them to the front of the... It's just a different way of doing things. I don't know if there's a perfect way, but we'll find out. We'll do what everyone else is doing and just move with the times, I guess.
Dream Theatre really have to like now change that game. No one's ever going to do that anymore. But
well, you I think if you're doing the list on a record, you would do it the old way.
Yeah.
You would put an arc of songs, and you put the songs strategically placed in a place that tells a larger story. But I think for Spotify, you have to conceptually maybe look at it like singles more.
Yep.
So I can see why people are doing that, and I think it seems to be working, and it makes sense. It's just a different way of approaching it. But what it has done is it's taken the decision making to some degree and put it in the pundit's hands rather than the radio station's hands. So let's say there was a 5-minute track song. Radio's not going to want to pick it up, but Spotify might. And because the pundits might enjoy it, they mightn't care that it's 5 minutes. So if like I've seen a couple of rappers that are quite well known dropping longer length songs, and they wouldn't get the traction on a commercial station that people would anticipate, even if they're hugely popular. But on Spotify they will. And so now the audience probably has a greater say in what becomes a single than maybe previously. So that's one of the benefits.
I can just see the Chasing Ghosts viral hit coming.
Let's hope.
I want to talk about the lyrical messaging in a lot of Chasing Ghosts material a little bit. We touched on it a little bit earlier, but I think it's worth going into because you will openly address and speak about quite harrowing or quite in-depth topics. One particular thing that I think is off a song that's going to come off your next record was about some physical violence being enforced on a young man through no ill will of his own, and you tell a really good story about it. And I'm wondering what it is that drives you to address social issues and personal issues in your music in such an open way.
Yeah, I guess to frame that up a little bit for people listening is there's a song that's about a housemate that I used to live with. I used to live with these two chaps that were awesome legends, and we used to live above George's Bar in Fitzroy. Now, one of the guys was coming home from the Peel, which was a well-known LGBTQIA plus bar. It's been a big part of the queer community, the broader queer community's cornerstone, and the gay community in Collingwood. And on his way home, he was quote. This was a quote used at the time by the two people that assaulted him. Was they were gay hunting, and it's a pretty repugnant. Obviously, it's a pretty repugnant thing to do, and it's such an out of step thing to do with that area too, because it's such a liberal, open-minded area. So I think that's the contrast was quite shocking for people. But you when I lived there, you live in a bubble, and so you forget that 2-3 suburbs away, you've got people that living in bizarro world where they feel might is right, and they just want to throw their weight around and bully people. So my buddy's coming back from the bar and assuming that he's going to have a good time with these guys, so we're going to kick on a party and whatever else, and next minute he's dragged into an alleyway and beaten within an inch of his life. And under the Victoria's at the time, the new hate crime laws back then, they were looking at a really severe sentence, about 15 years, and they were going to be made an example of, I think. So he'd advocated, he's going to work with lots of makeup on, covering up like really damaging bruises and broken ribs and things of this nature. So when he got into the courtroom, he'd advocated that they weren't sent to jail, that it would simply make them worse, and that they should be given a second chance, which for me is what made this story such a great story. And I think a lot of my topics could be perceived as political topics, but what I'm looking for is the story. I'm looking for the humanity in the story, and so the very human experience. And I probably very early on in Chasing Ghosts wanted to dive away from the boy-girl breakup songs, or that were typically what a lot of pop songs are about, and I understand why, and they serve a purpose, and they're great. Love songs are terrific for people, but I kind of wanted to steer away from those topics and have more complicated topics, and so I don't particularly consider them political, and I try not to make over political opinions. Rather, I try and bring it back to the humanity that we all share and what we have in common. And I'm asking for empathy, really. And what would you do in this situation? Can you not empathise with this character? Surely that's what I'm hoping. So, if someone's homophobic and they're anti people who are not heterosexual, then I'm asking that person to hear this story and to really consider how you would feel if it was you. And this is, pre-interview we're talking about empathy, and that's what I'm trying to get people to channel a little bit. And maybe in some spaces that they didn't expect to find heroes. I really think this friend of mine is an exceptional example of what it is to be a good person and to be an empathetic person. He put his own absolute trauma and horrendous beatdown aside because he had enough wisdom to see that there might have been more at play. He said to me openly, he's like, they'd have gone to jail, do you really think they'd have got better? And I couldn't answer him like, oh yeah, they were going to learn their lesson. They absolutely were not going to learn their lesson at jail. That just wasn't going to change anything. But they are forever indebted to this man. And it's a horrible price to have to pay for two other people to become enlightened, and they certainly he shouldn't have had to have done it. But there is something admirable, I thought, in his behaviour that I wanted to share, just this more complex story, and have people reflect on it. What would they do? How would they feel? So, and that probably rolls into lots of other stories that, on this new record in particular, we've dived into, and things from soldiers coming home with PTSD that have taken their own lives, and Aboriginal massacres that have occurred, and elders reflecting on those massacres and how they feel about the current state of things. And I'm not setting out to make political topics. I'm setting out to bring the political points back to the humanity, back to the basics of what we all have in common, and try and tease that story out a little bit more.
With you wanting people to empathise with the things that you say and the topics of your songs, how do you go about trying to get that point across without, I guess, shoving it down throats, trying to push people to do that, but you want them to come to the same ending but their own path and their own way, and get that, even if they think that it's their own idea or their own take from that message gets across?
Well, we're yet to see whether or not I can do that. we're talking about it as if there's an agreement. I'm sure there's going to be people who will be annoyed and upset, and that's the risk you take on stepping away from something that's so obvious and so safe that nothing really gets said at all. And you've got to be prepared to be unpopular for it, which I'm okay with. I think you sort of framed it up probably best, is trying to get someone to go on the journey and figure out how they feel about it. What I tend to do is not tell people what to think. I tell them a story and allow them to enable themselves to come to their own conclusion. And it is a bit of a skill, and when Lincoln and I are working in the studio on telling this story, we are mindful of the times, the context. No one likes to be lectured, no one likes unsolicited advice, no one likes to be browbeaten, lectured. you'll lose a lot of your audience if you're going to browbeat them. And we also didn't want to be pigeonholed as, political niche kind of band as like some sort of gimmick, rather than looking at how do you tell good stories. And so for me, one of those ways is doing the dance through difficult topics. And so two of the references I would probably throw to is if you were to look at Paul Kelly and you look at How to Make Gravy. That's if no one has heard that song, go and have a listen. It's a brilliant song about a brother not being there and being in jail for Christmas, and his thing was he made the gravy at Christmas time, and such a benign small thing triggers this great memory and this pain and this family's trauma. That sort of storytelling doesn't tell you how to feel about what crime he committed or if he committed a crime or any of those things, but it just gives you a snapshot of that story. Another one was the album Johnny Cash released many years ago called Bitter Tears. And Bitter Tears was an album dedicated to Native Americans and the invasion of the English, the French, and the Spanish coming into North America, and then the so-called the new Americans, the non-Indigenous Americans, having conflict with the Native Americans. And the way he did it, again, was just not to tell people how they should feel or just telling them what happened and describing these humans in this predicament. When we remove some of the labels and some of the sides and we stop making sides, but we just start talking about these humans. And you've got to be able to empathise with all the characters in the story. I think it's part of the skill you aim to hone in on and achieve. Hopefully, is the protagonist. You should be able to emphasise and see some of your own humanity in the good guy and the bad guy, and because we all hold the demons within, we all wrestle with how to be decent people and our own shortcomings, and so I don't think we don't need to remove that. And I'll give you a little example. There's a song on the new record, and it talks about a father not being able to see his child. And this isn't a pro-men's rights anthem. And it's talking about a guy not wanting to be a deadbeat dad, who's trying to have a go, and it still isn't quite working. And we were very mindful of, we don't want to send a message that somehow we've been absolutely oppressed and downtrodden as men, but at the same time, it was a true story, and I had to give this story its own space to be real. And this chap was trying his best, and he was doing the things at least he thought that he should do. And I think it just talks about kids raising kids, like young people struggling to come to the maturity of how to deal with complex issues when there's a little child involved. And I don't think, I don't try and pick a side. I try and tell a story and show empathy from all the participants involved in the story. So that's how I go about it. It's been a challenge. It's been why would I want to write music if it wasn't challenging? Do I always get it right? Well, let's wait and see, hopefully. But if not, we'll blame Lincoln. That's, he should have cut me off. But yeah.
I do wonder if you touching on Aboriginal massacres is going to be the one topic where that's the most difficult in terms of how people take on board the message of the song or get in touch with the story of the song. From the point of view that I think there's a lot of people, such as myself, who white, that will maybe immediately feel attacked. Mm-hmm. And I do think that's important, that needs to happen in sense of raising this conversation. Are you prepared or even maybe sort of looking forward to that conversation?
Well, I guess the question for me was, do you not sing about stuff or tell a story about stuff that was true because the truth is too challenging to confront. If that was the case, we wouldn't have Rage Against the Machine.
No.
We wouldn't have Susan Vega singing, "My name is Luca," talking about domestic violence. And am I meant to get angry at Susan Vega because there is a fact that a lot of men have done horrible things to women? Like, is that her fault? Do I shoot the messenger? Do I get up Zach De La Roca for pointing out what's happened to Latin Americans and Central and Southern America's constant horrendous attacks they've faced over the years from colonising powers? I guess I could, or I could get a little bit curious. And I think that what I would ask people is, whatever impulse you feel when you listen to these songs, try and lead with curiosity rather than judgment. And it would, if someone's sitting there feeling heavily attacked when I've at no point gone down that path, I would be thinking that it's a pretty self-absorbed. I'd be thinking it's a pretty self-absorbed place to be. That would be my, it'd be a pretty self-absorbed kind of position to have, is to make it all about oneself. But the listener is going to feel something. As for Aboriginal massacres, the white population in Australia understands, for the most part, what's happened to the Native American population in America.
Absolutely.
And doesn't make that about themselves. They have empathy for Native Americans. When it's Dances with Wolves, people aren't going for the soldiers, they're going for the Native Americans. They have a lot of empathy for slavery that happened in America. And when it's 12 years a slave, people aren't going for the slave masters, they're going for the slaves. When it's Django Unchained, I didn't see anyone cheering on the crazy rednecks. I've seen them empathizing with Django and finding this, like, really empathizing with his love of vengeance that seemed really justified. But when it comes to our own story, which is not too dissimilar, we feel a sense of collective guilt, perhaps, maybe being blamed for something that, white Australia, for a lot of white Australians, have never had anything to do with. So I think, to try and have a little bit of a grown-up opinion, what I would say to people is, white Australia is not... people today are not responsible for what's happened in the past. However, we are very much the beneficiaries of what's happened in the past. And we have lots of things in our country to be proud of. We're the 6th oldest democracy. We're the first country on the planet that gave women the opportunity to represent their constituents in Parliament. We were the 2nd country on the planet that gave women the right to vote. We were quite a progressive country in some spaces. We've done lots of great things. But like all colonised countries, we live on Indigenous people's land, who are amongst the poorest people in the world, who have had huge periods, the predominant amount of time that the arrival of Europeans have been here, as non-citizens or second-class citizens. And we're seeing that today. So I'm inviting people to try and empathise, but I don't think guilt does anything. I don't think it helps. I don't think blaming people for today helps. But what can we do to move past it? And at some point, the first thing is we start listening, we have empathy, and we aspire to do better. So that's what I'm trying to do as an Aboriginal person, is to share that with people and understand who my audience is. Predominantly, I have lots of Aboriginal people that support my music, but I have a vast audience of non-Indigenous people. And what I want them to feel is like that they can come closer to me, and that they can get love and respect from me and empathy from me, and ask the questions that maybe they couldn't ask. I don't want them to feel browbeaten, lectured. So we'll wait and see, but it's a path that is a tricky path to go through. it's a complex path, but you can't. I'm not going to water down the challenge. I'd rather try and rise up to the challenge and do it in a way that hopefully engages people. And it's a challenging topic, so let's talk about it. It's either here's one way to look at it. If I have to be silent, then there's a bigger problem. It's either me, the messenger, that's the problem, or it's triggering something deep within the listener. Now, you can give me heaps and heaps more power than I deserve and to say it's me, or you can reflect within yourself and assess whether or not something's moving within yourself. In fairness to even this sort of conversation out a little bit, as an educator who teaches Aboriginal culture and history to doctors, to lawyers, to Victorian police, who's worked in remote communities and prison systems, most Australians have not been taught a great deal about Australia or our past. So it frames the conversation up in a way that has omitted so much of our history. People just really don't know. So it does feel out of context when the Aboriginal community speaks up a lot of the time. People think, oh, it happened 230 years ago. They don't realise that wage equality between races is something of the 70s and 80s. They don't realise that my father would have been considered under the New South Wales Flora and Fauna Act rather than a citizen until 1967. So these sorts of things feel very distant, and it doesn't feel like the Australia that non-Indigenous Australians generally are experiencing in the big cities. So I'm just mindful of that. It's not a matter of taking a side, but just trying to understand all perspectives without the truth being chipped away at. And this is my truth. This is a historical fact, but this is something that I felt needed to be talked about. And anyone who knows me knows I've been a proud Koori person. I've always spoken my mind, but I've always tried to pull people together rather than separate them. If I achieve that, I'll be happy. I dare say I will ruffle a few feathers, but so be it.
I definitely think you found the right medium, and I think you are the right person to have those conversations with people, given your unique characteristic in that you are an educator in the field, as well as being the musician and being a Koori man yourself. Something I want to touch on at the moment is there are more Indigenous or musicians being profiled in Australia on a greater level than perhaps ever before. You've got Thelma Plum, Briggs, and they're bringing with them similar messages of inclusivity and of opening the conversation with people. Is that something that you're finding inspiring?
Well, both Thelma and Briggs, people I've had the pleasure of spending some time with. And I think they're brilliant artists in their own right. Really good storytellers, especially I think rap's a great medium for storytelling, and I think Eminem does it well. I think country music is as well. Certain genres probably lead to storytelling a little easier than hardcore perhaps, which is usually about statements. I find it and feelings and directing them towards an audience. I think it's only natural that you sing about, as an artist, you eventually try and be more and more vulnerable, and you're trying to share that vulnerability with people because deep down we all feel that. We're trying to bring something out of the dark and into the light, and we have to, you can't water it down so much that you're not saying anything and you're just giving platitudes to people because the truth is so uncomfortable. Rather, you're trying to shift people, and I think Briggs does that in some songs, perhaps differently to others. So for me, things like, it could be the track, I think it's called Bad Apples. I think it's a brilliant storytelling track. I really enjoy it. I think it's really insightful. Versus some of the tracks he's done with AB Original, which seem more like social commentary. They're both social commentary, but more specific to changing the date and things along those lines. For me, I'm more interested in the storytelling aspect rather than the political aspect. But my politics fall very much in line with his regardless. I do think we should change the date. I don't think that's the one thing we should do. I don't think that'll fix all the problems by any means. I think it's one of many things. Indigenous recognition, there's probably a lot of people in the music industry that a lot of folks don't know are Indigenous. That they might be assuming they're something else, where nowadays people are more confident and more comfortable to speak out, and non-Indigenous allies have helped in that space, saying, you know what, we've got your back, you be you, there's nothing wrong with just being yourself. And there's a lot more young people feeling like they can come into the space as a confident Aboriginal person than maybe in the years gone past. But there are definitely Aboriginal musicians that a lot of people wouldn't know are Aboriginal, that are just, playing bass or just playing guitar. And, I don't walk up to everyone and say, oh, g'day, my name's Jimmy, I'm Corey. No different to you don't walk up to everyone and go, oh, my name's Brenton, I'm white.
No.
It seems like a bizarre thing to have to mention. But yeah, I definitely am seeing a progress. I see progress everywhere. There's a lot of things that aren't progressing. There are a lot of really serious issues. But in the arts, we probably have more people prepared to go on the journey with us and understand us and find similar humanity and commonality between us. So it's been promising, would be to say. And a big shout out to Denzel from Baker Boy.
Yeah.
He's a lovely chap. He's a really nice bloke, and what he's doing is terrific. And he's singing some songs about empowerment, and he's letting white Australia connect with the languages of this land again. And I think a lot of non-Indigenous Australians want to know more about their country. They want to know more about what they've been, what our history's covered up. People want to be able to speak the Australian languages. Nearly every time I educate people, at the end of the day, there seems to be a recognition from non-Indigenous people of how much they've also been lied to. They've also been disenfranchised. Now, I'm not trying to say these two things are comparable, but there is a recognition that I think if you're an Australian, regardless of where your roots come from, we've all got to find balance here now, and I don't think it needs to be at the expense of one another. I think that our languages should be available for non-Indigenous Australians to learn, so they too can read the street signs, they can understand the land, they can have a relationship that's with it. And I can't see the harm in that. I can't see the harm in becoming more educated. But we'll see. I'm sure there's plenty of other people who have a different opinion, and I'm happy to engage on that opinion. I'm just looking for that our children and our grandchildren have a better life here than our parents and grandparents, if that makes sense.
Staying on the topic of progression and everything like that, now you went through a situation recently. If you touch upon that more, that's up to you, but we did see a sense of progress in this, but through a lot of pushback. There was a lot of, people trying to stop that progress from happening, whether it be their beliefs, their stance, even down to, even if it was just downright ignorance. There was a situation that had a lot of pushback. The end goal was progress, even if there was resistance to that. How do we, progress without the resistance, or is to a certain extent, is resistance good because they're at least standing up for something that they believe in, regardless of, I guess, that situation itself?
You're talking quite cryptically.
Yeah, you're making it very hard, Mike.
About, when I was in Singleton?
Yes.
Right, yes, Singleton. This is about you. Well, let's not mix words. Let's just say what it is. So I was in a pub in Singleton. I walked in, and up on the door, there was, up on the wall rather, there was a photo of an Aboriginal man who had been noted as a bushranger and had committed some pretty horrendous crimes, supposedly. He supposedly had killed women and children, and the then photo was displayed up on a wall in an attempt perhaps to be historical, and either side of the man were the two chaps that had shot him in the back and killed him for a prize. I think it was 10,000, a reward, not a prize, sorry. I think it was £10,000 had been put on his head or something to that effect, and either side of them there's photos of these men posing with their guns and this guy's dead body sprawled out along in a photo on the wall. The comment I'd made was I thought it was repugnant and I thought it was inappropriate. It's not a museum. It didn't have context. It had news clippings that were pretty biased. We've got to remember we're going back in the period of the White Australia policy. We're going back into a period where Aboriginal people were considered not human, and this guy wasn't given a fair trial or any sort of representation. There's it's quite well documented that people were lighting cigarettes off his feet when his body was on display dead at the pub. But I also understand the pub's perspective is it's a historical event that's occurred in their area. So my argument simply was, if this was Ned Kelly, I wouldn't think it was appropriate if it was Ned Kelly to display his body in a way to remove his humanity. Ned Kelly has a story. I think the story, wherever you sit on it, is what it is. I think a lot of it's turned into a big folk story, like a modern day Robin Hood. But there is nonetheless a story there that needs to be told, and the historical version might be a little bit different to how we think of it. In this guy's story, there were plenty of clear overtones about him as an Aboriginal man, and most of probably what the pub was doing was seemed like ignorance more than anything else. I don't know if there was bad will. I didn't assume any of those things, but I spoke up, and I didn't think it was cool. And as an Aboriginal person walking into that pub, and my family does have a connection to that man's story, as a Thangari man, I was not particularly stoked with the presentation. It's a pub, it's not a museum, and would we depict in a time where Jewish people were being treated as vermin, would we depict some of those things and pop them up in a pub, regardless of what side of the argument you stood on? Probably not. So that was kind of my point. That was met with a pretty strong personal attack, where people wanted to kill me. They were going to come and bash me and assault me, and people threatened violence, etc., etc., etc. And of course there was the racial slurs. My favourite was, "This isn't about race, you abo so and so and so and so," and it was like, well, it might have been before, but you've kind of stitched them together pretty well, these two topics. So I wasn't stoked on that, and it's funny because I was sort of being like deemed as too sensitive, but white fragility in Singleton was well and truly on display. Like, get the sunscreen out, guys, because you're not going to make it through the summer if you can't handle a little bit of pushback from me. So suddenly it caused a big issue. Now, to the pub's defence, in an effort to seem fair and reasonable. They eventually took it down, took the image down of this guy's dead body on display. And that was negotiated between myself, some of the elders in town, and the pub. They didn't apologise. I didn't need an apology. And I checked into the pub initially, and then because of this, I checked myself straight out and said, well, I'm not staying here. And I took my complaint down off their profiles online for the same reason. I thought, well, if they're prepared in good faith to remove the image after hearing my problem with it and other people's problem with it, after initially they did double down initially and wanted to defend their position, but in good faith they took it down, and so in good faith I took mine down in the same spirit. Could it have been dealt with better? Yeah, maybe. Probably if I'd had a preference, it's maybe they didn't double down. Maybe don't tell an Aboriginal person what Aboriginal people should be offended by if you're not an Aboriginal person. The yardstick is not, it's like I've got a reasonable sense of the yardstick around what causes offence. I've been called plenty of things over the years. I don't need someone else to tell me. I don't need non-Indigenous people to tell me what's racist. Because, well, we did that journey for quite some time in Australia and it didn't work out real well. Generally, if you're not, the problem with being privileged, whoever it is the privilege of not having to realise you're privileged. And I'm privileged too. Many of us are. I have light skin, so I do still have white privilege. Like I would be in some sort of bizarro land denial if I didn't think that was the case. But what happened was I was very, very surprised because I didn't anticipate the amount of support and defence. And I had a lot of guys from motorcycle clubs that are big, tough brutes having lots of empathy because we'd had a lot of good conversation on this topic and saying, hey, we're with you, this is not right. And a lot of the musicians from the hardcore community and the punk rock community and the alternative community stand with me, which I will forever be grateful for. All non-Indigenous people who said this is not the Australia that we want. I had a lot of the tattoo community do the same thing. So all these people that we probably look at and think are not, tough. Some of them are pretty tough and rugged and covered in tattoos. Very much we're saying, hey, this isn't the Australia that we want. And they were educated and they were able to form really logical defensive arguments around, hey, this just isn't on. There's a way to go about this. We're not saying anyone's a horrible person. We're saying this has not been dealt with in the best way possible. Let's make a change. I feel, though, the community in the way that some of the press, especially the Newcastle Herald, that's right, name and shame, the Herald really tried to trigger things as a white versus black, hype up the tension, really turn each other. And that's why I declined to make comment, because I could see what they were doing with other people's comments that they'd interviewed. And this happened on a couple other papers. NITV were really terrific and quite even-handed, and SBS was quite good about it. But there were a couple of others that really were like, well, this will create some good clickbait and stir people up. Here's the essence of it. If you are a non-Indigenous person, you're as much my brother as anyone else. I'm only going to lead with love and pull you closer towards me. If you're a non-Indigenous woman or you identify as whatever makes you feel comfortable, if you're non-Indigenous, I'm only going to pull you closer towards me. I'm not here to browbeat people, but I will not water down the realities of the truth. And lowering the bar of respect doesn't help. Now, the counter argument that some people would have come to is, well, what about how Aboriginal people, how they treat non-Indigenous people? No one is escaping personal responsibility for their actions by addressing something that probably shouldn't be at a pub. And I'll tell you how I know what someone's intention is. I ask them, if this is an attempt at respect for the Aboriginal community in a historical event that's occurred here, and it's just been fumbled. Then put up an Aboriginal flag in your pub. Immediately was laughed at. Immediately. And even elders in that town said to me, there is no way that's going to happen. So that to me says a lot about someone's intent. Don't claim that you've socially made a social faux pas, because I'm absolutely prepared to. I'm not the arbitrator of what's right and wrong. You know, people have good intentions and they stuff up. But if you're not prepared to back it up with consistent behaviour in line with your argument, that tells me it's a pretty weak argument, that it's you're just trying to placate the fact that you've pissed a lot of people off. Now, immediately, if I'm the problem with noticing it, think of the hundreds and hundreds of people that would have walked through that pub previously and thought, I'm just not going to say anything. And that was my response to people, was when people try to defend the situation, was simply, if you knew about it previously, why didn't you speak up? And they said, well, we didn't want drama. So is that how we're all going to live our lives now? That we all just shut our mouths and aimlessly walk into situations that are really inappropriate? We've seen how that happens in the past. I compel people, it is worth being unpopular to speak the truth. It is worth putting yourself on the line to speak the truth. Because if it's not us today, it's someone else down the track tomorrow. And that doesn't mean browbeat everyone and lecture everyone. People aren't always going to have the right evolved language on a topic. If you call me the wrong thing, I'm not going to get spun out of control about it. I'll tell you what I prefer and, move on. But this topic is what it was, and I thank all my non-Indigenous brothers and sisters from the music community, from the tattoo community, from guys who ride bikes, everyone who stood beside me, and I commend you and I thank you, because you're the Australians that I'm proud to call my brothers and sisters. And I think there's more and more people finding a voice and saying, hey, we can do better, we're a good country, let's sort this out. But we've got a few generations of people we have to try and talk through the process with, I guess.
That's a really positive way to leave that topic, I think.
Thanks very much.
It's definitely a sign of what you were saying earlier, is that progression here is possible. And I think that's an example where it took a lot, but you got somewhere, and you probably opened up thoughts and conversations to people that otherwise were never going to have them. So that's a really good and inspiring thing, and one of the best things I think an artist can do is inspire a community around them to think about things in a different way. Time for a bit of a rad break here on the Radults podcast. So, Jimmy, your travels as a musician and as an educator and as a tattoo convention host have taken you everywhere in this country, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you had to choose 3 places that you could visit in Australia and that you'd encourage other people to visit, where would they be?
From the sounds of it, not Perth.
Perth's great. Perth's beautiful. And I'll plug Singleton. It is beautiful. Please, Singleton people, don't feel completely alienated. Starting to get... Oh, hello. My 3 favourite places. Broome.
Cool.
Broome for sure. Or as the locals call it, Broome. Broome. Broome is this amazing amalgamation of... You know how people always refer to, like, multicultural societies as melting pots?
Yeah.
Broome is like the most literal version of that. So everyone, it's not uncommon for people to have 4 grandparents of 4 different ethnic backgrounds, and the language, to have some Chinese words thrown in, to have some Japanese words, to have some local Aboriginal words thrown in, Afghan words, and it's represented in the food, and obviously European culture is represented there as well. But it's this great amalgamation, and I think when you see the Pigram brothers, they're a really good representation of something that comes from Broome, and that it's just a super rich tapestry. It's very slow there; everything slows down. It's just so unique, and it's gorgeous. So, easiest way to do that is get a flight to Darwin. get an extension via Kununurra, which in itself is quite an interesting little spot, and get out to Broome and slow down. It's awesome. Second spot would probably be around Larrakia. I think it's called Larrakia Falls. I could be wrong, but there's not too far outside of Darwin. It's a pretty touristy spot, but there's some gorgeous spots you can do in the NT and down to like everyone should go to Uluru at some point. I think Uluru is probably one of the most spectacular spots, and you know, I'll bite. Don't climb up the rock.
Don't climb it.
Don't climb the rock. Don't be a goose.
You're not a rock climber.
Yeah, you're not a rock climber. That's a good one. You know, it's just as simple as you just respect people's wishes, and then there's certainly lots and lots to see there without having to. So I would encourage everyone. It is phenomenally bigger than it can ever be captured on a photo. It is probably the size of Melbourne City. So it's stunning, and it's such a mystical spot. And around the world, it's in my top 2 places. The third place I think would probably be potentially somewhere in Tasmania, and I would lean towards, all of Tasmania is great. I'm sure there's a few Tasmanians going, have you been in my town? It's definitely not. But I think Tasmania is pretty stunning, and the West Coast in particular has some gorgeous spots and a few bizarro spots, but regardless, they're interesting. And yeah, I would definitely get amongst Tassie as a spot. So if you're on the mainland, it's a cheap flight down there. Yeah, it's great, definitely. Those would be my 3 spots. So yeah, hit the Territory, Northern WA, and Tassie. It's just about, I think, getting away from the beaten track a bit. Yeah, that'd be my thoughts.
I'm interested to know, bringing it back to Melbourne, you have to name one coffee shop to get a coffee at.
Ooh, this is fighting words now. This will get people more stirred up. Alright, well, big shout out to Kadama in Williamstown. Kadama is Cody and Tash, who own Kadama. They've also got a spot in Yarraville. Got a nice little restaurant there, a little cafe there, and they've opened a third one, or they're about to, in Newport. But they just do the small things right. They do really good coffee, and they know what's up with that stuff, and they're really inclined to. They want you to walk away happy. There is another place I would plug, which is an Indigenous restaurant. I'll just see if I can find the name on my phone. An Indigenous restaurant from Yarraville.
Mabu Mabu?
Mabu, that's it. Well done. Yeah, you remember that. It was right on the tip of my tongue. They do amazing food, and I think it's a real treat to try something a little bit different. But favourite coffee shop at the moment is definitely my bros, and sits down at Kadama. Big shout out.
Nice one, check it out.
I think you've been a great guest on the podcast, and a perfect example of what happens when someone's willing to take advantage of the opportunities that life presents. A large portion of what we try to do with this podcast is inspire people to take advantage of the wonderful opportunities the world can present if they're willing to take a chance. So, irrespective of what their craft is, even, if you had a chance to give a piece of advice to a young person who was looking to chase their own dream, what would your tip be for them? So what would your tips for being a Radult be?
Well, probably the first one would be to not be so critical on oneself, because I think when you're highly critical on yourself, you tend to be very critical on other people. So I think if you can be a little bit generous and forgiving with your own shortcomings, that'll help you be generous and forgiving with other people's shortcomings. So often when I hear someone running someone down or knocking someone else, my first impulse is to think, well, that must be how they talk about themselves and how horrible that would be. And I think most people have a lot of negative self-talk. So you've kind of got to let go of a little bit of that. That would be my life advice. As specifics for achieving goals or trying to be successful, success, I guess, is in the eye of the beholder. It's what one person measures as success, another may not. There's probably two things. One is everyone wants to feel a sense of progress, and that's when we feel happy, is when we feel some sense of progress. The other is realizing that your success or your goal most likely will come. However, it may not come in the way that you anticipated it would. And that's a very bizarre kind of experience. And the other is keep going. Just go for the journey. Enjoy the journey, not the destination. I know a lot of people who have found themselves very miserable being at the destination they'd always dreamed of being at, and had missed the whole journey through this anxiety of wanting to be somewhere else. But then getting there and being like, oh, like, really good example would, from an outsider's perspective, would be Kanye looks pretty bloody miserable. Mm-hmm. And the guy's a billionaire who's married to a billionaire, whose siblings are billionaires, who has access to the president, and is a world phenomenon and has surpassed probably all the things that his idols have done. And yes, he's got a mental health issue, clearly, but he doesn't seem particularly happy. And I think a lot of people, happiness is something that actually comes from inside, and the practice of happiness is simply to focus on gratitude, because our anxiety talks so negatively in our mind, so our head chatter a lot of the time is negative. So if we can actually take the time to practice, and I think as I've got older I'm more conscious of that, so in the morning might be a really good idea if someone's in a bit of a rut, is to sit down for 5 or 10 minutes and just practice a little bit of gratitude. Last bit of self-help, unsolicited advice, and I'm certainly not a master of these things. I try and practice them, but I'm no better than the next person with it, would be to take 100% responsibility. Because when you give up responsibility to other people, you give up opportunity to other people. You're essentially saying, my happiness depends on what someone else does, and you can't control that. So there's a really important part about taking 100% responsibility for your wins and your losses, and trying to remove some of the emotion out of the losses and put them into, okay, well, adapt or die. What do I have to change here? Let's move on. Let's keep going. Let's not beat ourselves up. Let's keep going. And before you know it, there's traction and things get a bit of momentum and there's change. My only goal has ever been that, and it started very early on in the piece with Chasing Ghosts, is whatever anyone comes into interaction with me, is that I could leave them with a little bit more love, a little bit more warmth, and feeling a little bit better about themselves, ideally. Because whether or not I was going to sell one record or a billion records, the goal was always I wanted people to feel a little bit better than when I left them. And because I was blessed enough to have people do that for me. So I just pay it forward. That's the other thing, I guess.
I like it, and I think it's probably a good thing to end on such a positive note, and some good advice like that. Where can people check out your work, be it your outreach stuff, what websites to check out for that, but also your musical endeavours too? Where can people find that online, or other elements?
Well, if you want to get out to a tattoo expo, let's start there. If you want to get out to a tattoo expo, we're in Perth, Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne, as a rites of passage at Melbourne and Sydney. Tickets are online. Turn up at the convention centres on the day, get out and meet some people, meet favourite artists, buy a bunch of prints support your favourite artists and get a sense of maybe I shouldn't have got Gaza to do that home job in the backyard on the tattoo machine he's just brought online while he smoked a glass barley. Maybe don't do that. There's lots of insanely talented. There's some artists at the moment that are doing things that you just wouldn't have thought even possible 10, 15 years ago. So definitely big shout out to the crew at Ravens Hollow for some of the stuff that they're doing. When it comes to me teaching Aboriginal culture and history, I work for lots of different organisations, and certainly don't have to listen to me. I'm one opinion of 750,000 Aboriginal people's opinions, and I'm one of 25 million Australian opinions. My opinion, I'm not, by no means the arbitrator of truth and whatnot. I would encourage people to get curious and to do some of their own research. May I suggest, there's a brilliant book called Blood on the Wattle. That would be really well worth looking into. Another book is Why Warriors Lay Down and Die, and that's probably understanding the trauma of colonised peoples and how it affects people, that it's intergenerational and it really takes a lot of power off people and their ability to see a future. And the third would be Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu. And I think it gives us you could go online and see some of his TED Talks, it'd be great. First Australians is online, you could watch some of that online. A Secret River is online. It's another great film about the Black Wars, the frontier wars that occurred in Australia for 25 years. And as for music, Spotify, jump on Spotify, and if you get onto YouTube, and there's some films there you can find out, Chasing Ghost Music, or it might be under I Am Jimmy Kyle, or I Am Chasing Ghosts. There's a few people you gotta, online you gotta search for these things on YouTube. So, but you could jump on there. Spotify's the go for me. I would definitely suggest that. iTunes, I believe, is still momentarily selling records online, but I've heard whispers on the grapevine that's probably going to change as well. So, and get out to a show. Facebook as well. You can come out to a show and have a conversation and come and sing along and have a good time, and everyone will be hopefully pretty loose and big smile on their face and a bit of banter. That's pretty good. That's generally what we do, a bit of banter. But I just want to thank you guys. When that stuff did happen up north, your support was really appreciated. Just to have a rational voice in the storm of frenzy. And the one thing is probably I was aware of at the time is that the internet gets outraged quite quickly and it forgets quite quickly. There's something else tomorrow. But I appreciated that as guys making your way in the music scene here and helping lots of artists with your podcast and picking people that you consider Radults. I really appreciate your support, so it's not forgotten, and I always enjoy my time with you both. Thanks, boys. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
There you have it, folks. That's been another episode of Radults. It's time with Jimmy Kyle. The man is a certified Radult, and we highly recommend you check out all the wonderful things he does. Have a red day.
Visit Singleton.
Can I just go to the bathroom very quickly?
Absolutely.
Jimmy's taking a toilet break.
Welcome to the Radults podcast. This episode sees us joined by local larrikin Jimmy Kyle, best known for being a member of the band Chasing Ghosts, as well as emceeing at Australian tattoo events nationwide.